When I decided to put this presentation together, my first thought was, boy, I wish Ken could tell me about his early years. Well, my wish was granted, thanks to an interview that he did with Oklahoma State University. Ken will now tell you a little bit about himself. I learned a lot. I got a hunch you will too.
Sure. I was born December 20th, 1945 in San Antonio, Texas. My father was just out of the Army after the war. And he and my mother, he was working for the federal government at the time, and ended up in Stillwater shortly thereafter, where I grew up until the fourth grade. And then Dad got promoted within the Department of Agriculture to their headquarters in Beltsville, Maryland. And so I really went to high school in and around Washington, D.C. And then because the Dahmses had a long line of history graduating from OSU, I elected to go back to OSU and came in September of 1964.
That is really interesting, kind of peripatetic childhood. Do you remember anything as a young child that kind of pointed towards the career avenues you would later take?
No, actually, I did not. I did not develop an intellectual curiosity until I got to Oklahoma State. My high school was filled with athletics, emphasis on athletics. I ran track, ran cross country, and played basketball for all 3 years there. Was a very mediocre student, underachiever, and when I got to Oklahoma State, I began to realize that I never would make the Olympic team in track and field or any other sport, and decided I better knuckle down and study. So that's what I did.
So your parents encouraged this enrolling at OSU for college?
I'll be pardon?
Your parents encouraged your choice of OSU?
No, really, they left it kind of up to me and stuff. I think I chose OSU over some other schools because I had relatives in the state, all throughout the state, aunts and uncles and things like that I could retreat to on a weekend. So I couldn't make it back to Silver Spring, Maryland, so all the time. So that was very nice. They provided me a lot of support through bitching about all sorts of hard courses and why they wanted this and that. So it was a good support group throughout my college.
Now, did you know when you started school what your major was going to be?
Yes, almost from the start. I had an interest in political science and an aversion to the hard sciences, so I might add. So actually, I can recall a day or two before classes started, Dad, who knew several professors from being at Stillwater and stuff, we went over to Dr. Donnell's office, who was then head of the political science department, and had a talk with him regarding what to expect from if I did major in political science. So,
and you were involved with the Delta Chi fraternity, is that right?
Yeah, not from the start. My freshman year was spent in the dorms, and it was a very productive year. Academically, not very much socially. I really tried to buckle down, try to figure out what the professors wanted, how to study in college and things like that. I had some friends from my Stillwater days that had gone to elementary school with me, and one in particular, Terry Chappell, at the end of my freshman year, came over, said, hey, we'd like you to think about pledging Delta Chi next year. And so I did. And my sophomore year was primarily trying to get used to fraternity life and a little bit different than dorm life while still trying to keep my grades up. So it was only in my
balancing act.
yeah, it was only my junior and senior year that I became active in campus activities. Spring semester of my junior year, I was elected to the Student Senate. I was Art and Science Student Senator. I had served on the Arts and Science Student Council prior to that, but that was my big jump into campus politics. And then when Bob Swafford left at the end of my last semester, my senior year, the Student Senate selected me as Student Senate President. So I spent the last semester, my term was up the fall semester of '68. I was kind of wondering what I was going to do as far as student activities in the last semester, and Swafford's leaving set that up nicely. So he spent the last semester as President of the Student Senate. I looked upon, myself as seeing generally both sides of an issue as it came up. But some of the irony, I guess, and I was going to get to this later on, but now that you brought it up, was the fact that I felt like I got a very good education while I was here at Oklahoma State. It held me in good stead through my master's at American and actually in my law degree at Harvard. I thought I was prepared, and ready to meet the academic challenges. But it always seemed a little ironic to me that, especially in light of the restrictive Board of Regents speaker policy, that you had all this openness in the classrooms. Here I was reading John Stuart Mill on liberty, just a impassioned defense of absolute free speech. And then in the real world, there were people that I shouldn't hear because of somebody's belief that they could do me harm or could do society harm, or just wasn't the appropriate place for a university, no less. And that began to, there was severe cognitive dissonance there that led to finally making me really mad. I was as disappointed and as mad as I ever was in my lifetime about the restrictive speaker policy. And I know there's a lot of other issues involved, that time, but for me, that was the big one. I couldn't quite come to grips with the opposite, the opposite, belief that there should be, some policy that restricts free speech. The answer for, speech that you don't like or find reprehensible is more free speech. In retrospect, since I was drafted about 4 months after I left OSU and was at Fort Bragg in basic training in October of '68, I should have participated and listened a little more to that, but that was not my thing at the time. My thing was the speaker's policy, essentially, it's amazing how very little I paid attention to in the outside world until I got into the outside world. Then it became very, very important. So
you served in Vietnam?
No, actually, I went through. I was drafted, went through basic training. From a summer job, I had a top secret security clearance, and they put me as a documents clerk at the Pentagon for 2 years. So I thank the lucky stars to this day that I did. Many of the people I'm going to meet, my fraternity brothers and stuff, actually had the experience of going over to Nam and seeing combat. So Matter of fact, I came from meeting one person at the student union that was actually shot down over Hanoi and was a POW for a while. So I have great respect, but I was glad that I ended up in a place where I didn't have to kill anybody and nobody was shooting at me. I practiced law in Dayton, Ohio for a large law firm for 3 years. And then
Was it civil law or?
corporate, real estate, and stuff. And that 3 years convinced me that I was not cut out to be a private lawyer. I had a grounding in political science, local government. I went to work from the law firm to being the lawyer for a countywide public health agency in Dayton, where I remained for 30 years first as their lawyer, then director of administration, budgeting, and stuff like that. It was the type of activity that I think I was really cut out for. If I didn't have to pay the bills, I would have done it for free. And if you can say that about your work, it's not work. And so it was very satisfying because I lost a lot of sleep from recalcitrant employees and policy problems, but never ever any sleep on whether I was doing the right thing or doing work for the public good. So I retired from there in February of 2004. My wife and I, my late wife, who died about 2 years ago, traveled for a couple of years. Looked at one another and said, "I'm tired of traveling." I said, "I'm thinking I'll go back to work somehow." And I got a job teaching in the School of Public Health at Wright State University. And so I've been there ever since in one capacity or another. Teach a couple graduate courses, help them out from time to time with some legal problems and stuff, and thoroughly enjoying life. So it's other than the death of my wife, which she was my best friend too. Things have been very good, for me since I left OSU.
Well, I'm sorry about your loss.
Thank you.
You can easily tell from that last clip that Kenny really missed Emelda. But now we're going to talk to some of his other friends to find out what they thought about him.
Emelda was going to Tufts University, and she had this thing where she would type up papers for these guys, mostly that went to Harvard. So she knew guys at Harvard, and she was dating one of them. Well, it happened to be Ken's roommate. Well, after meeting Ken, Emelda got more interested in Ken than she did the roommate, and she dumped the roommate. So therefore, she started dating Ken. And that's how they stayed together and continued to meet. And that's when she started bringing him home. And we all decided, yeah, he's an okay guy. We're going to keep him. Emelda and Ken loved to camp. I don't care where it was, what kind of weather it was, they loved to camp. In fact, this kind of couple camped on their honeymoon. They went to Canada, they went to Lake Louise, and stayed for 10 days and hiked every day. Now, this is the type of people they were. They camped in Vermont. They would camp wherever they traveled. They lived in this putt tent, this little tent, just the two of them. And they would have campfire, they cook, and they hike. They loved to hike. And this to them was enjoyable. And in the meantime, I sat back and said, "You go ahead, you can hike all you want, but to me, I'll stay here at home." Emelda and Ken were the happiest people I ever knew. In fact, that happiness ran over into everybody else that was around them. If they were in a group of people, everybody else was at peace, happy, sharing, caring. And Ken and Emelda, there was like this spot saved for them no matter where they went. They would fill in that spot, and it would just be the most wonderful gathering in the world. Except for Ken, he was my lawyer. I needed him at times. I would call him, and he'd say, Rose, I'm not a defense lawyer. I'm a health department lawyer. Plead guilty.
Okay.
We grew up in Vermont, so all of us came home to Vermont for Christmas, even after we got married and had spouses. Well, Ken was the same. He came home with Emelda at Christmas. Well, we had a ritual where we went to midnight mass, and then after mass, we would walk home. Now, you have to remember, this was a small town. It had a college, but we were real small. And we would walk up the middle of the street because obviously there wasn't anybody else around. And Ken would start singing Oklahoma at the top of his lungs walking down the street. He knew every word. He sang it until the end. He never went in the house until he was done. And this was done every time we were home for Christmas. Well, eventually, our neighbors were a little concerned when every time he came home, he sang Oklahoma. And then we explained to him that he went to Oklahoma State. And they said, well, he's not a bad singer. And I said, well, it's something he enjoys. And it made him really happy. You should see him. He was just like on top of the world singing this song. And we were his audience. And he loved every minute of it. When my sister got sick, she had colon cancer. It was really hard on Ken. It was hard on both of them. Neither one had ever been sick before, so this was all new to them. And they did the best they could, and they managed through. But after Ken lost Emelda, things were difficult. He stayed in Lebanon, but he lived down on a single road with the house. He was so lonely, so isolated, wasn't involved in anything. And then some good friends from Yellow Springs said there was a place available for him for an apartment. So Ken took a look at it and he moved. And moving was the best thing that ever happened to him. In fact, he started joining boards. He started joining other committees. He started playing bridge. And you know what? The old Ken was back. And I was so happy to see him.
I'm just going to give you sort of how I knew Ken and what I learned about him from how I knew him. So I was, teaching in the School of Medicine, medical ethics and things like that for years, and was invited somehow when we got the public health program going to, I think it had been going up a few years, and Ken came along, and eventually somebody asked if I would be willing to co-teach a course on public health ethics and policy with him. So that's how I met him back in about 2012, 13, 14, somewhere along the line there. And we did it for about 9 years, I think. So I knew then that he had volunteered to teach in the public health program after he'd retired from PhDMC, where he'd started as a sort of staff attorney and moved on to, for reasons that I never understood, the HR department, human resources, where I think he had a number of interesting legal challenges, but he was also, a very principled person, and I don't know what drew him there or what they needed him for there. So that's a piece I don't know about. You maybe do. So we had a couple of years, and then Emelda got sick, and then she died, I think in the summer. And that just took the steam out of Ken. He was devastated by this. And I hope there will be some people you can speak with or who will come on Saturday to speak about her, because I gather she was his very best friend, his life partner. She, hung the sun, the moon, and the stars for him. And he was just devastated. And it had been a long journey of, I believe, breast cancer, and he'd been there with hospice and been at her side, and it was just hard. So when we were teaching that fall, he was a shadow of his former self. And I eventually said, hey, let's go for a walk. One of many we shortly took. And we became friends in the course of these walks. And I eventually suggested I had just joined the board of the BW Greenway, which is a small sort of nature conservancy type conservation easement oriented group. And I knew that he and Emelda in particular had cared a great deal about environmental stewardship, and he joined and lasted a lot longer than I did on this board. But I think getting involved was helpful for him. And he still stayed at that wonderful cabin in the woods where he and Emelda had lived, and started playing bridge up in Yellow Springs. And eventually, a friend of mine who lived there told us of a place across from her, and he moved there to a place called Park Meadows. And there he got much more involved with the bridge crowd and was on a number of boards in the course of his life there. And he kind of had a new lease on life. I doubt any of it ever replaced his life with Emelda. But he was able to keep up many of his friendships, and he had many friends. But it was always kind of, I felt anyway, that it wasn't the same as traveling with her, sharing friendships with her, that kind of thing. And it was lovely to kind of sense that partnership, that loyalty, that affection between them. It was just, he never spoke of it a lot, but I got the sense that she was really very precious in his eyes. So about my experience of Ken, as you know, he was extremely accomplished as an athlete, as a lawyer, as a public health person, as a bridge player. He was a crack bridge player. As a teacher. As a teacher, I can say this about him. That formidable memory that he had as a lawyer, he never forgot a case. He never forgot a student. He never forgot a face. He never forgot a paper we read, and he never forgot an argument in class. So years would pass, and he'd say, remember so-and-so in class that day? And I'm like, huh? He was amazing that way. Could have run for, public office with a memory like that, but not the right personality, I think. But he loved debate. He just loved debate. And part of what he loved about our class is that the aerospace medicine residents at the base were in some capacity in charge of public health at the base. And in that way, they had to get an MPH, and they apparently had to take our class. So we always had, I don't know, close to half a dozen RAMs, we called them, residents in aerospace medicine. And these were experienced people. They were experienced docs. They were all over the political spectrum. They included the tree huggers, but you'd think of them as typically kind of conservative. But they were bright and fun and very confident, enough to push back against some of the arguments in class. And Ken loved that. I will say, he loved to, frame our relationship in that class as he was the kind of rational conservative, and I was the just unhinged progressive from Yellow Springs. And the unhinged was part of it. He had a lot of fun with that. I actually got a little annoyed at times, but anyway. So Ken read Thomas Piketty's monster book, I forget what it's called, twice. He didn't really do literature, but the greatest novel and only novel worth reading on the planet was Catch-22. And he was quite determined that I read this. I don't think there's a woman in it, but I got 3 copies of that before I finally bit the bullet and read it. And it is terrific. I hope you know it.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was determined I would read that. The last infusion of books was a more recent Piketty book that's upstairs here that I haven't yet read, but perhaps I will in his honor. Maybe that'll be my airplane reading coming out. So he read these very meaty things and got them and appreciated them. And, there aren't a lot of people he could share that with, but he loved that. He had a gang of friends. I'm sorry, this will tell you more than you need about me, but he played fantasy football on a regular basis. I had never heard of this. I was like, what are you talking about? But they had some scene. They would where they go to some bar and just go after it, however you do that. And he loved that. Um, he had an annual week at the beach. I think that might have been a bridge week. I can't even remember who was there, but they kept it up. A few of them had lost their partners, but they kept going, and he was welcome after Emelda died. And that week at the beach every year in the spring meant a lot to him. I'm not even sure where they went, but it was a regular thing. Yeah, and another week in Vermont every year with Emelda's family. And I have a place in Vermont, and he came to see me a couple times after that event. But that trip to Vermont was really important to him. Emelda's sister has been in touch with me and has told me a little bit more about that. But I know there was a vast extended family, and Ken was close to lots and lots of them. His running friends, I've met a few of them. You probably know them all. Jimmy Gross is like a big one. He was close to, I think they were a kind of separate family. He stayed in touch with all of them. One of them has had a stroke. His name escapes me right now. Was an attorney at Wright State. You know, the guy who was head of track of athletics at UD. He was another one. I've met him many times. His name just flew out of my head. Unlike Ken, who would never forget a name.
Yeah. You're talking about Bob Hickey.
Rich Davis.
Well, and Bob Hickey used to be the state representative.
He and his wife are very close friends.
Yeah.
And his bridge players in Yellow Springs were a final community that I think was invaluable for Ken. Not just because they played very good bridge, but I think they somehow kept each other going through COVID. I think they were even playing bridge online somehow through COVID. But the bridge crowd, which is big in Yellow Springs, includes a lot of Wright State people, but young and old, sharp people. He really found his crowd there. I just want to mention Ken's pride in being invited to his high school in Maryland, when he was invited back there not that long ago to be inducted into their track and field hall of fame, whatever it was. Maybe it wasn't just track, maybe it was basketball too, but that tickled him.
So what I remember about Ken is his good sense of humor. He was always laughing, cracking jokes, making us smile at our meetings, keeping it light for everybody. One example of his jokes was he used to always bring donuts into the office, and he would tell me to go report back to public health because they had a big no donut policy, and he'd tell me to make sure to tell public health that we were eating donuts and it was our right to do it, and that's too bad. So he was trying to give public health a hard time even when he was at our office. I really valued Ken for his advice. He used to come into this office and he'd shut the door and he would say, "There's a little issue I need to talk to you about, Sarah." And then it may not be a little issue. Sometimes they were big, sometimes they were little, but he was so good to talk it through with. And he usually had the solution before he told me about it, but I always valued his advice, and I would go to him for advice as well, because it was always sound and he always could think objectively about what was best for the student and what was best for the program and how to deal with those sticky situations. Ken was also super generous with not just his time, but also his money. He always bring us donuts. I think we all gained a little weight because of the donuts. But he also, even after he retired, he donated so much of his time to co-teaching with other faculty and helping out with our accreditation processes. And he just loved to be a part of it and do what he could. And in fact, when a few years ago, he started the Ken Dahms Scholarship Fund. He did not want to call it Ken Dahms Scholarship Fund. He was way too humble for that. But he started a scholarship fund to help our MPH students that we are growing and are so excited to use for them. So Ken and Emelda, they were such a great couple. They looked and acted so happy around each other. It was always fun to be around them. They supported each other. Emelda was this competitive jigsaw puzzle person, and she used to go to all these puzzle competitions across the country, and Ken was her biggest fan. He used to go to them all with her. She would help us with our puzzles. We used to do puzzles in the office, and when she was here, she would finish them a lot quicker than we would.
And so we started working together. He was my co-faculty from 2015 to 2021. We had a wonderful experience advising students, teaching. It all comprised of meeting every week, then going through drafts of slide presentation or class material, designing or drafting assignments, grading those assignments. And so outside of the class, Ken and I really had a good collegiality. We were able to discuss so many different facets of how we can improve the course. In fact, he was instrumental in helping me design the whole course altogether, from its previous face-to-face version to its more hybrid and newer version, which was more interactive for the students. So he was a person who would be open to ideas, and I could really share or bounce off those ideas with him. And he was very encouraging in all aspects, in terms of my ability to share my thoughts with him, and he would be supportive in whatever aspects he would deem appropriate, especially for the sake of the department and for the sake of student interest.
Most fun I had with Ken was experiences not just at races and running events, but or car races or hockey games, but traveling to different places. His wife Emelda and my wife Doris would travel together. We'd go to social events together. In fact, I always had a saying, you can't go anywhere with Ken Dahms without having a good time. One day I had an extra pair of tickets to the Indianapolis 500, and I was asking around if anybody would go with me. And Ken just lit up like a light bulb, because when he was younger, traveling with his parents in Oklahoma on Memorial Day weekend when the race is held, Ken would listen to the radio whilst in the car with his parents traveling about. He would listen to the race announcer describe the first turn. I guess the guy's name was Howdy somebody. And he says, I'm Howdy, and cars are coming around the first turn into turn 2 and the beautiful colors of the day. And Ken never saw the Indianapolis 500, but he always remembered hearing the report from the radio. So when I said, Ken, I have tickets to the Indianapolis 500, he lit up. He says, I want to go. I've never seen it. I've heard about it. And once he went, he was stuck on it. And we went for about 20 years together to the Indianapolis 500. Ken and I ran and raced together, and Ken's specialty was the marathon. He was trained specifically for it, and he loved it intuitively. And what he also loved was the city of Boston, because he went to Harvard Law School, and he fell in love with his wife-to-be there. She was a student at Tufts. And Ken would go every year to run the Boston Marathon. And Ken and I first got together at the Boston Marathon in about 1983. And we were both in about, we both knew we were in sub 2 hour and 40-minute shape. And the Boston Marathon, if you don't know, starts downhill for 6 miles. And I was a very good downhill runner. And I hooked up with Ken during the first mile, and we started running side by side, because I said, we're both in about equal shape to run at the same time. And I'm a good downhill runner, and I can stay with Ken on this downhill. But every mile down the hill, from 2 miles to 5 miles, Ken would pick up the pace. And I said, well, I'm a good downhill runner. I could stay with Ken. Till I got to about 5 miles of downhill running with Ken, and Ken had picked up the pace every mile sequentially. And I said, Ken, this is much too fast. I said, I know I can't keep this pace up, and I know you can't keep this pace up. And I was trying to get Ken to back it down and stay with me. And Ken says, oh, I can keep this pace up. And he left me. And when he left me far behind, I said to myself, well, I'll see Ken long before the finish line. I'll see him walking, because he's going out way too fast for a sub 240 marathoner. Well, Ken ended up running sub 2:30, which was an out of the world experience for him. It was his tremendous personal best. He finished in the top 100 finishers in Boston that year. He got a special medal. I don't know if it was gold or diamonds, but he cherished it. And it was a breakthrough race for him and the best race of his life. Ken and I felt as we were actually brothers together in life. We were born 3 months apart. We spent so much time running and racing together and traveling together that Ken invited me on more than one occasion to travel up to Vermont with him, which was the hometown of his wife, Emelda, Middlebury, Vermont. So I had several trips to Vermont. He lured me up there by taking me up there to family reunions on the 4th of July, where we would sit in lawn chairs of his family's house and watch this parade go by. And Ken loved the parade because all it was a parade of every fire department piece of equipment that you'd ever want to see from counties all the way around the area. This past summer, 2022, on my last trip to Vermont with Ken, we did a lot of hiking on back roads and trails where Ken used to run during the days that he would spend time visiting Emelda up in Middlebury, Vermont. And for hikes that were too long for us, like his long runs of more than 10 miles, we would get in a car and Ken would direct me on the back roads of Vermont and say to me, "Rich, this is where I used to run." In fact, he added, finally, he said, "This might be the last time I get to see these roads."
One of the times that I most remember is that in July of 1978, I was a brand new employee at the Montgomery County Health Department. I had just been down to lunch and walked back into the building, and at the Montgomery County Administration Building in the basement, which is where the health department offices are, or they were at the time, I walked in, and it's a big lobby area, and to the right, I noticed a man walking into the lobby area, and he was easy to spot because he was shirtless, and he was sweating from head to toe. His hair was all wet, his shorts were dripping, and he was actually leaving footprints of sweat on the tile floor. I then noticed that this individual actually walked into the health department offices, and that's where I was going. So I walked in probably about 5 seconds later, looked around for this individual because I thought maybe he was looking actually for health department services, but he was gone. I could not find him. So then I walked back to my cubicle where I was supposed to be. And then about 2 days later, my boss came to me and said, "Hey, would you come to a meeting with me? And it's going to be in a conference room, and you can sit in behind me, and it will be on topics you really don't understand, but I just want you to get a feel for it." So I did that. And right before the meeting started, I heard someone say, "Where's Dahms? Would someone go get Kenny?" So in 30 seconds, approximately, this person comes into the room, and my eyes must have got big as saucers because it was the sweat monster that I had seen a couple days before in the lobby area. And this individual came down, sat, engaged in the meeting, was very insightful, and was very compassionate with everyone in the room. When the meeting was over, then he immediately came over to me and proceeded to ask me a series of questions about me and my family. And he made me feel like a very, very special person at the Montgomery County Health Department. And I went on then for the next 26 years and saw Kenny with those same sorts of behaviors with everyone who he came in contact with. He was down to earth. He was very thoughtful. He was clearly brilliant. And he was very, very kind to everyone who he came into contact with. Ken Dahms was a very unique person. He was extraordinary, one of my favorite people of all time, and I will miss him dearly. Kenny's role at the health department was to be legal counsel, which was a very difficult role to play because of all of the different situations that the health department was in.
even though that he was the most compassionate person around and made everyone feel special, Kenny was also very, very good at what he did. He would at times have to be the lead writer on many reports, and he would also have to do things such as find the best approach to certain situations that were uncomfortable for employees, for the Board of Health, for the community, and for community partners. And oftentimes that takes a good deal of intelligence and savvy. And Kenny was the go-to person at the health department to carry out that function.
I started running with Ken back in the early 80s. I first met Ken at the Dayton Daily News River Run. It was an 8-miler. I had heard about Ken. I had never met him, but I heard he was going to run that morning of that race back in the early 80s when I showed up there. But he didn't show up until about 1 minute before the race started, I think, probably 5 minutes. But at any rate, he showed up. I come running up at the start line. And like I said, I'd heard about Ken. I knew he was a really good runner, and he was in my age group and so forth. But he shows up in these old running shoes, and I don't even think he had any, was wearing any socks. If he did, I couldn't see them. No shirt. Looked like a pair of worn shorts, and he had these gloves on, and I was wondering what the heck, but they were weighted gloves, and he had just come from a run. I'm assuming maybe from the county building. As I reflect back, but it looked like he just finished a 8-mile run, but he was running that race, and that was the first time I'd met Ken, and I thought, well, I think I can probably run with him if he's tired and got these gloves on, but I never saw him again after that. He was gone, and he was such a good runner, and so that was the first time I'd met Ken. One of my vivid memories of Ken was, of all things, the day that I got married. Back in May of '83, I had scheduled a race the morning of my wedding, which my wife wasn't happy about. I think she was afraid I was going to get hurt or whatever. And of course, the race was early in the morning, and it was in Waynesville. And at that time, early on, I was getting beat up by everybody in my age group. I couldn't even win my age group, and I thought, well, I'll go to this small town race, maybe win some cheap hardware or something in my age group. Well, lo and behold, Kenny shows up there, and so we ran the race and everything, and so then when it comes time for the wedding, of course I'm at the altar, and my wife procession, and she comes up to the altar, and she has repeated this story many times, that the first thing I mentioned to her was, did you hear about my race this morning? And I told her, I said, yeah, I said, the Waynesville race. I said, I won my age group. And I was second overall. And of course, she would ask me who was first overall. It was Kenny Dahms. So that's always been a memory forever. And on our as we left the church, on the car, it was decorated, and someone had put first in his age group, second overall. So the question I got the entire day and thereafter was, hey, who was first overall? Well, it's Ken Dahms. So everybody from this day on seems to know who Ken Dahms is, whether they're runners or not. Well,
one thing I didn't know about Kenny was how much he enjoyed car racing. And I know one time it was Kentucky Speedway. Forget what the guy, because I don't follow car racing, but I went down with Ron Rohr down the Kentucky Speedway. It was a big race there, and Kenny and Rich Davis were there, and I didn't realize Kenny's love of car racing, which a Harvard grad and an attorney and everything. I just couldn't imagine him enjoying car racing that much. But gee, he knew all the drivers and times and everything. I was amazed at that.
First impressions, Ken right away, comfortable. Just, he's a guy you can be comfortable with. Just salt of the earth, guy you want to hang out with. But my first impression when we worked together on the board was that this guy was serious and it was exactly what we needed. It was a new board, new responsibilities, just taking ownership of the land, the programs, its staff, to manage the staff, the properties, everything. And we needed folks who could come in and just, give us some guidance how to do this big new task. And Ken came up, sat down, got comfortable, rolled up his sleeves, and just, he was that guy. So one of the things that when I first started to learn more about Ken than just what he was going to do for the Glen Helen Association, was that he'd done a lot of really cool things that interested me. I remember he mentioned to me once that he knew that I like to read and write mystery novels. And he casually mentioned, yeah, he used to stop after he ran the Boston Marathon and have a beer with his friend Jerry Healy, the mystery writer. And I said, well, I know Jeremiah Healy. It can't be the same guy because, he's the contemporary of Robert B. Parker. I mean, I've read a bunch of his books. That guy's the real deal. You can't mean that guy. And he said, oh, yeah, that's my buddy Jerry, who just sort of casually would run the Boston Marathon in a sub 2:30 and have a beer with one of my idols, the fiction writers. Really interesting guy. Humble. You'd never know he was that interesting of a guy because he was just quiet and humble, but boy, if you started talking to him, it ran deep, the stories. He was really interesting. So in addition to being just a cool, comfortable guy that I'd like to hang out with, I always thought of Ken as like, man, that's a guy you want to go for a walk with or have lunch with or a cup of coffee or a beer. But he was more than that. So when I was asked to take leadership of the board, it was a big task, and there was a lot that had to be done, and there were some hard tasks and some hard jobs. And Ken was one of those guys who was on the governance committee, and I would call Ken and say, look, I want your take on some things. I got some questions that'll help me guide me through some of these more tricky aspects of what we're maneuvering now. And he always stepped up and said exactly what was on his mind, thought things through. He could see the beginning of the chessboard, the middle of the chessboard, the far side of the chessboard. He would lay out all the plays. Here's what's coming, and then he would caution me, tell me what to be careful of, but also just, offer his confidence. Always very just offering his confidence and saying, you got this, we can do it. Let's do this. Always quick to call back, always comfort to me, always a help to me. So I really appreciated that about Ken. He made that job look easy, and I don't think it was an easy one to do.
Modest, quiet, thoughtful. Ken is not a person who participates in a board meeting and likes to hear himself talk, but every time he would engage and have something to say, it would always be cogent, helpful, and move the conversation along in a productive way. He, one of the things that we do at Glen Helen is we have a raptor center where we take care of birds of prey that are in need of rehabilitation. We try and release them out for a second chance at life in the wild, and we do lots of programs with educational birds and involve everyone from kids to senior centers in those programs. we have periodic fundraisers for the Raptor Center, and at one point Ken reached out to me. We were going to be having a cocktail party for the benefit of the Raptor Center, and he said, you know, this is the last kind of event that I'd want to go to, but I want to support it. So watch in the mail, I'm going to be sending you a check in support of it. And that was the kind of person that he was. Modest, didn't want to make a big splash, but wanted to make a big difference for the things that he cared about. Ken was this extraordinary combination of modesty and generosity. None of us had any idea, for example, of his prowess on the marathon course, or as a champion runner in his youth. It wasn't the sort of thing that he led with. It wasn't the sort of thing that you would have even known unless you talked to somebody else who would fill you in on those details of his life. That wasn't what he was about. What I remember him fondly for is that combination of modesty and of generosity with his time, with his intellect. One of the things that I would, as executive director, I'd lean on board members to help us out with fundraising appeals, with sealing envelopes, with writing little notes to donors, and it's not the most fun project. But Ken was the one person on the board who would finish the slate that I had sent his way and say, send me a note and say, hey, I'm done with my done with the group envelopes that you sent. Happy to take on another stack if you want to leave them in a bag on your front porch. I'll come by and pick them up. And he did that on multiple occasions, wanting to make a difference, even with the work that was the kind of project that few people would really be enthusiastic about. He knew that it was making a difference for the organization, and he was happy to dive in for it. I think that one of the things that's on my mind, and I know I've heard echoes along this lines from talking to other staff and board members about Ken, is just shock and sadness. Ken joined the board during the pandemic, and so he kind of became part of an organization at a time when it was harder to get to know one another. When we were having a lot of meetings on Zoom, and periodically we'd come in person and then we'd retreat back to Zoom. and I think that we all thought that we were going to get to a place where we were back to normal, where we were engaged with one another, where we were gathering in person, where we were spending time not just doing the work of the organization, but engaging in this place that we all care about together in person, and it feels like a real loss to realize that Ken won't be joining us on that journey.
Well, I first met Ken because of getting the job here at the Yellow Springs Senior Center as executive director. He was on the board when I was hired, and so my first meeting with him was virtually at my interview, and he was just clearly a good voice of reason and wisdom on the board. I finally got to meet him in person when I took the job, and within just a couple weeks of taking the job, I sent a message out to the board asking if anybody would go along for the Yellow Springs Pride Parade. I didn't know the board members well, and I was hoping it would be a social event, but it was also COVID time. We had to ride in a car together. Who would want to be in a parade? And boy, Ken was so enthusiastic. And having him ride along in that car, I think anybody who knows Ken remembers that, oh boy, and the oh, this is great moments. And he would get so enthusiastic. He smiled and waved and had a flag throughout that entire parade. We had so much fun getting to know each other. Um, it he was shy to tell anything about himself. It took me a long time of knowing Ken, which was only a year and a half or so, to learn what a fascinating life story he'd had. He was so humble. You know, Ken, again, the humble Ken always came through. He was best at asking questions and not often giving advice or stating his intent. He was a real natural leader in that he knew how to let people feel they had shared their opinions and then back it up, reflect back on it, and give a group idea that felt comfortable to everyone. Curious. I got to know that while he was board president at the senior center, but even in the last half year while he was no longer on the board, he and I were in contact quite a lot as he served other nonprofits in the area. And he and I had some really wonderful conversations. He always wanted to hear more about policies or concepts that might help his other projects. So Ken has a neighbor, Sue. She is known as Chef Neff in the community. She is a trained chef that does culinary training throughout the world, as it turns out. And whenever she had a spare plate, she would be sure that Ken was invited to the table. He always raved that her meals were his favorite food in the world. So apologies if that offends anyone else who's cooked for Ken. But she took him a meal even the week before he passed away. He was intended to be a dinner guest with us at her home, and instead she took the plate to him. And even a couple days after that, I heard from him how delightful it was that he had been thought of.
He got me on the board. I was on the board as the treasurer. This is 2 years ago. And they were having trouble finding a president. So he invited me over to the Trail Tavern to get a beer. And the bet was how many beers would it take him to talk me into becoming the president. And actually it wasn't very much because being a president was probably easier than being a treasurer. So, but he had to gloat about that. He managed to con me into becoming the president to take over his position because he'd been the president before that. And it was his job to find a new president. And by God, he found me. But it was a nice evening, and we talked about a lot of things, including the center and where it ought to go and so on and so forth. But he was quite involved with the operation here. Really liked it. Yeah. We actually had Thanksgiving dinner with him just this last Thanksgiving. We invited him over. We have something called Orphans Day, so people who don't have family around, we invite them over, and then we have a nice evening and dinner. And so we were there with 3 or 4 other people. He had a cough, though, but he was in good spirits, and we had an interesting evening. It was a lot of fun. He'd had this cough for about a month or so, and we invited him then for Christmas. And my wife talked to him on Friday, and Christmas was on Sunday. So she may have been among the last people to talk to him. He was feeling well, still had the cough. She had earlier threatened him she was going to pick him up and take him to the emergency room if he didn't go talk to a doctor. And he promised he would, and in fact he did, and he got some medicine for his cough. She called him then on Friday, and he said, yeah, I went to the doctor and so on. And he seemed in good spirits again. He was getting better, but he didn't feel up to quite coming to the dinner.
Another quality that I will always associate with Ken Dahms was the fact that he always took time to listen. Ken was a true champion for the greater good. He understood that public health's role, when you distill it down to its simplest form, was to help people live long, healthy lives. But he also knew for that to happen, we needed to reach out to those less fortunate. And we needed to promote health equity. Now, interestingly, health, quote, equity, unquote, wasn't the buzzword during Ken's working public health career. Nonetheless, he promoted that concept in all of his interactions. Ken promoted equity because he knew that the world was loud and that those less fortunate, those most vulnerable, and those most underserved tend to whisper. Ken listened, he understood, and he served as an ambassador to amplify their voices. Another quality that Ken Dahms demonstrated was empathy and compassion. Actually, those two should be a prerequisite for employment at public health. I'll never forget the time in the 1990s when public health received a complaint letter from a local neighborhood group expressing concern about exposure to contaminants from an adjacent facility. The letter that we received was poorly written. I mean, it was just terrible grammar and just contained a multitude of misspellings, run-on sentences, and incomplete sentences. Well, I can remember being in an internal meeting. We were all looking at this letter, and it could have been very easy for us to criticize how that letter was written. I mean, think about it. That's just human nature. Also, public health is a data-driven and science-based organization. It has a highly skilled workforce that exceeds in technical writing. So it could have been very easy to criticize the letter. That never happened. And the reason that never happened is that Ken spoke first during this meeting. And we all know that Ken spoke a lot, but he spoke first. And to paraphrase, he said, "We all understand what this letter says, and we understand what is being asked of public health. How do we plan to help these citizens?" That just shows that empathy and compassion go a long way. And they're also a collective responsibility. Ken had both, and that's a very rare trait for individuals today. One quality that I will always associate with Ken Dahms was the ability to predict future outcomes. Ken had the uncanny ability to analyze all the information and the data at hand, and then accurately predict the outcome of a variety of public health initiatives. So food safety and water quality issues, air pollution control concerns, communicable disease outbreaks, and, well, of course, the NCAA basketball tournament pool. No, seriously, he was that good. He was very accurate at predicting outcomes. As a result, several of us affectionately referred to him as Nostradamus, after the 16th century French philosopher, astrologer, and seer Nostradamus. The reason Ken was so good was that he always did his homework and he did his research. He had tremendous expertise in public health theory and practice, statutory requirements, as well as the good governance model. Ken had more expertise than any other employee I've ever known, and we will never see anyone like Ken Dahms again.
Everybody loved Emelda's cookies. Everybody still talks about Emelda's cookies. They were beautiful and really, really good. And he would bring them in every year. And I asked him one time, did you do anything to help Emelda with all these cookies? And he goes, yeah, he did. He stayed out of her way, is what he said. So great. He played music for a while when he was always in administration, but he was housed in EH, in environmental health. And when he was over there, he would play all kinds of music, anything from Peter, Paul, and Mary to Dire Straits, just anything. I gave him a Pink Floyd CD one time to listen to, but he said that the cats jumped off the sofa and left the room, so he didn't think Pink Floyd was for them. But I swear Ken worked in EH over there so he wouldn't have to dress up. I think he wanted to be a public health attorney so he wouldn't have to wear a suit. He could wear his khakis and be comfortable. He wasn't your typical Harvard guy, but he was very smart.
I got to know him obviously through the health district. He was the district's attorney, and because of that, I had a lot of exposure to him, both in a professional setting and fortunately then outside the office a little bit at a couple of the office picnics. Probably the most honest person I've ever known. the most careful, methodical thinker that I've ever worked with. And I think one of the kindest guys that I ever worked with. We had a lot of fun. Working with Kenny, I got to know what a really messy office looked like. Ken had a knack for putting all of his papers in piles, and there would be a progression of piles across his desk, across the bookcase behind him, and then when that got full, he would go to placing piles on the chairs, the office chairs inside the office, so that when you had a meeting with Ken and you went down and you wanted to be sure you were on time, you'd get there, and typically the first thing you had to do was take one of the piles off of a chair so you had a place to sit down. And you always had to do it so that you took the whole pile and put it in one place, because Kenny had a pretty good idea what was in that pile. He didn't want the pile broken apart and then getting intermingled with other things. That's one thing I learned about Ken is he had a lot of piles of paper, but he pretty much knew what was in each pile, so that if you gave him kind of a puzzle to look into and find out what we did in another similar situation, he'd begin to look through his piles, and he'd sit there and kind of thumb his lips, and 9 times out of 10 he could go to a pile and find that paper that he was looking at without spending a lot of time. I think the first time I saw Ken was at one of Doc's picnics. I saw this guy out there dribbling a basketball. There was always a basketball game going on, and he was in the midst of it, and I didn't know who he was, to be honest, and I thought, I wondered if it was a neighbor had stopped by or what, and I don't know if someone told me that's our new attorney or what, but I think that was the first time I ever had time to spend around Kenny. If he'd get involved in something, he was very intent on what was going on. If he was there to play basketball, he was there to play basketball. And similarly at work, there was a time to have a good time and have fun, but once he started to digest the meat and potatoes of whatever the problem was that I had come to see him about, he got really intense sometimes. And working in environmental health, we had a lot of occasions to have to develop cases to take folks to court. And we'd walk in there real proud of ourselves for the airtight case we thought we had put together. And Ken had a kind of a knack for letting you down softly. He would look through what you had, ask a few questions, and generally we would leave the office with a laundry list of things that we needed additional things that we needed to get, or needed to observe, or needed to photograph. But I appreciated it because it never, he didn't demean the person that he was dealing with. Ken was a lawyer, I wasn't, and he understood that. So he always was really good about trying to explain what it was he needed, what he was looking for, why it was important, why this airtight case that I had put together really didn't have a lot of merit. And in that respect, I think he did a great job of representing the health department, as well as all the other agencies that we dealt with through the Human Services Levy Council and all that. Ken's opinions and guidance and direction were sought out by an awful lot of people. He had a very common sense way of looking at problems and offering solutions, and helping those that he offered solutions to work those solutions through to a final end. Ken was just a lot of fun to work with, but it was high quality fun, I guess you could say. People that knew Kenny in formal settings would be probably shocked to know that he ran a large sports betting operation out of the bowels of the health department during the Selection Sunday and NCAA basketball tournament. I think Kenny worked a full year just to get to Selection Sunday and be able to run that operation. The first year that I was there with him, the forms he tried several times, I think, to give me a form, and I said, I'm not interested. I don't follow basketball, and gave him all the excuses. And I said, but you know, my wife would have a real interest in this, and probably my son too. And so here's some forms, take them home and get them into me. So we did that, and that became a running joke. Every year when the brackets were available, he'd always make sure, Case, get this out to Sue and get these other ones out to Nathan and get them back to me. That was something else that I remember about Kenny. Is my name's Mark, obviously, but probably 80% of the time that he saw me, it was Case, and it just, well, for whatever reason, and I'd always, what, Dahms? And that was always led to a chuckle, and then we'd start off with whatever we were going to talk about.
Everybody loved Kenny. Everybody loved Kenny at our high school. All the cheerleaders liked him a lot. He dated a couple of them in high school, and all the guys that we played basketball with, we all loved Kenny because he was such a good guy.
To the outside world, Ken was an elite athlete and respected professional. To his old teammates and classmates, he remains our cherished brother, quiet leader, and humble example of how to better lead our lives.
I want to thank all the individuals who helped me put this thing together. Your willingness to be involved has helped many people learn a great deal about Kenny. Thanks again. In many cultures throughout the world, people believe that true death doesn't come until people cease to speak your name and don't remember your deeds. I believe this. So speak their names often and remember their deeds, and Ken and Emelda will live on for many, many years.
Randy says this is God. We're about to ask for God. It's too high for all of us to climb back there. Ken's gone home. We're all gonna miss him. He was a great guy. He went way too soon. I'm gonna go. What? You take out climbing down here.
I'm going to decide